House of the Dragon Season 2, Episode 3 is definitely what I'm going to talk about in this video. But like last time, I have a little bit of a, before we get into the episode, little like section here at the beginning. This time I want to talk about, for lack of a better header, green and black apologists or anti-apologists, or I don't know. People who just like have a lot of animosity, rage, upsettedness, just a lot of about how the show is handling either the greens or the blacks. And I mean, the people who were like, this show is just constantly going so easy on the blacks. Meanwhile, commenter B is like, this show is just constantly going easy on the greens. They made up this scene literally just to make Rhaenyra look better. They made up this scene literally just to make Alicent look better. And whichever one extreme you're on, you don't see any balance and you don't understand any like reasons why the narrative would be done this way. So anyway, no it's not. And also, yes it is. So now, see, I agree with all of you. But in all seriousness, the show has diverged from the book in many ways over the course of season 1 and into season 2. And in most cases where it has diverged from the book, it has taken events and characters, whatever it is, that seem more black and white, more cut and dry in the historical narrative of the book Fire and Blood. And it's given it more nuance, more gray, more mess, more context. The characters, they've been humanized by this more kind of in-depth narrative. Telling the events summarized in Fire and Blood doesn't give you that, because it's written like a history book. So it's like, well, here's the person, their name, their birth, their like rank and status. Here's some facts about them. That doesn't like tell you what the vibe was. That doesn't tell you like the emotions of a private moment where they had a bit of doubt about what they were about to do, because history wouldn't remember the scene in the bedroom before they made the speech where they had doubts about it, you know? And so the characters that feel a little bit more one-dimensional in the historical narrative of Fire and Blood, they can become one-dimensional villains, one-dimensional heroes, etc. They're given the opportunity in the show, House of the Dragon, to show doubt, to show vulnerability, to show kindness, what have you. So the show is not going easy on any character or any side. What the show is doing is adding nuance. Fire and Blood is not a novel in the way that A Song of Ice and Fire is. If a historical text a la Fire and Blood was to tell us about Jaime Lannister, then he'd probably be a mustache-twirling villain. Then if someone was to adapt that historical text and give us the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, then the purists would be like, oh, this narrative is being soft on Jaime. Yeah, or it turns out if you actually give the whole picture, if you actually give context in a complete person rather than just the cliff notes of history, you might actually be forced to consider them as a person with a point of view. So that's my rant about people complaining about the show going easy about greens or easy on blacks, and you're all wrong. All of you. Anyway, so episode 3. This actually was the first time this season that the show did something that I did not like, so I thought we could start there, just to be spicy. So the one thing that I did not like in this episode, and then therefore in this season so far, because so far I've been pretty much a fan of everything, was Helena talking about her grief. So I think I know what they were going for, and in concept, I broadly like kind of the idea of what they were going for. You know, feeling guilty over having sorrow or guilty over having grief when other people have it so much worse than you or have it the same as you. Like, what right do you have to feel, you know? I think a lot of people have felt that way at one time or another, you know, and that's why we're always saying that, you know, just because someone has it worse doesn't mean that you're not allowed to feel sad about your life or whatever. So, like, sure, like, in concept, that's like a fair, you know, moment, a fair conversation for a character to have, but it just didn't work, in my opinion. Helena is oddly perceptive in the show, but not in like an empathetic way. Helena is prophetic and has sort of otherworldly connections. She seems pretty unable to relate to the people around her. So to have her talk in a way that's suddenly like very in tune and in touch with how the common man is feeling, it didn't ring true for her character of what we've seen of her so far, certainly. And then also just like the delivery, like in the scene, even if she was a character that we did have reason to believe would have that level of sort of intuition and empathy about other people, it came off as her feeling apathetic rather than her feeling numb. I think they were going for numb, and it just didn't come off that way. So she didn't read as like horribly grieving and unable to cope, and she also didn't read as like numb and shocked from the loss. She just read as kind of like, well, you know, what right do I have to be sad? You know, other people have it worse, you know. I forgive you, Mom, because that too. Then when she apologizes to Alice, or excuse me, when she forgives Allison, and is like, you know, I forgive you, Mom, you know, for sleeping with Kristen, I guess. It almost like this, like Allison just showing kind of shock and surprise in that scene, which is like how she should. I had no problem with her performance, but because who she was reacting to and what she was reacting to was Helena kind of feeling kind of flippant almost, then it almost felt like, I know that's not what was intended by the scene, that like Allison was meant to be surprised that her daughter would say this over something so like, you know, fraught and whatever. But instead, like, because Helena was reading so cold to me, then it almost felt like Allison was looking at her daughter like, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you more upset about this? Because that's kind of how I was feeling. So her look of like bewilderment, Allison's look of bewilderment was kind of like, girl, do you understand that your kid is dead? Like, is that computing for you? You seem like upset, but not the way you should be. Not that, you know, there's a right way to grieve. You know, it was a weird scene. And I just don't think, like, the text with the performance, with the context, like, it just did not work for me at all. I think I know what they were going for, and it wasn't working. Well, and I think that, like, that's kind of a big problem, because, like, we keenly feel the grief of Rhaenyra over the loss of her child, and I know the sort of counterpoint on the green side is Alicent, not Helena, but still, to see the way Rhaenyra grieves her child, and then to see the way Helena is kind of like, not? It makes it feel like, to the people who were like, oh, the show is clearly positioning the blacks to be the ones to root for, you know, it's in moments like that, it's like, well, Rhaenyra shows much more grief over this death than Helena seems to. Like, Helena seems kind of inhuman in her reaction to this. So anyway, yeah, I didn't like that. I don't think it worked. Okay, so things I did like, though. Harrenhal was, everything to do with Harrenhal. Loved it so very much. So I loved how it was shot. Daemon approaching Harrenhal and the dark foreboding, kind of like, it was almost like a mystery thriller, you know, this lone approach, and as he's like creeping through Harrenhal, it shows us the destruction and the sort of disrepair that the place is in. So Harrenhal doesn't actually seem like that good a get, but still very foreboding. And this creeping through the rain in your armor, you know, a dragon isn't much of a boon to you in a situation like that. Like, someone slits your throat in the dark, you know, around the corner. Like, who cares if you have a dragon with you? So Daemon feels very exposed and vulnerable. And watching him kind of creep through in the rain without a soundtrack, perfect choice, no music, makes it so much more tense, just the pattering of rain. The rain, which would mask the sound of footsteps, so you feel even more like you don't know if you're going to be approached. But yeah, watching Daemon walk around with a sword through the rain, through this like decrepit castle. What it most reminded me of was Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, going out in the rain and like trying to find the Beast, which, you know, that is not an insult. The Disney animated Beauty and the Beast is a fantastic film with so much more visual tension than the live action adaptation. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Anyway, and then the meal, where again, it feels like this like tense thriller where you don't know who to trust. And even though the fact that they were kind of unassuming puts you even more on your guard. An enemy that's obviously hostile, like, you know where you stand, but people who seem welcoming, it's like much more tense because you're like, oh, but are you though? Now, I will say, this isn't a criticism so much of this episode or of this season or anything, but last season, several times the show kind of, you know, picked a version of events as opposed to leaving things ambiguous, and I kind of complained about that, because in Fire and Blood, here's me being the purist, in Fire and Blood, there's many instances where the text will say, oh, well, you know, we don't quite know what happened here. History tells us it might have been this, or it might have been this, or one account says this is what happened, and another account says this is what happened. So we can't really say for sure which, maybe neither of these is true. That is, of course, one of the many ways that it succeeds in feeling authentically like a historical text, is that kind of moments of like, well, we don't actually know, it's lost to history, or like the accounts conflict with each other and there's no way to verify. Like, I like that about it, just like in the, oh, this feels like a history book kind of thing. But also the ambiguity of it, just leaves that little bit of like that historical mystery, the room where it happened, no one was there, we'll never know. So anyway, there's multiple times in Fire and Blood where it's like, it's not clear who actually was the one to do the killing, or who actually was the one, whatever. So the show in season 1 oftentimes was like, well, they just pick one and like they're gonna say it's not one of these many options, it is one specific one. And so one of the things they did this with was with the killing of Harwin Strong, which, if you recall, was Rhaenyra's, the father of her children. So he dies in a fire, which that is true. That's true in Fire and Blood, and that is not in dispute. But, who caused the fire? Who stood the most to gain by Harwin's death? So the show decided to concretely say that Larys Strong was the one that did this, whereas the book makes it ambiguous that it could have been Larys, because there is a good case to be made for why it might have been him, but also it could have been Daemon. And so the show did not leave it up to like, oh, might it have been Daemon? It's not Daemon, it was Larys. So that we have this conversation in Harrenhal where they're like, we have no love for Larys here, and like, isn't it pretty sus that like Harwin and his dad died in a fire here, where like, does that seem likely to you? And I was just thinking, it was a great scene. It was well performed. The tension was great, well scripted, excellent, as far as it goes, like in this season where we already are at. But I was just thinking how much better if you changed nothing about this scene. Exactly the same, shots, dialogue, everything. But in season 1, we had not been clear about who had killed Harwin. If we had left it ambiguous, how much juicier this scene would feel with the same kind of like smirking, like ambiguous Daemon as he always is. In that scene where an audience is not actually sure if he was the one that killed Harwin, so Daemon's like reaction would be something that would be so fun to try to watch. In the same way that in the previous episode, when Rhaenyra is like trying to figure out if he is actually responsible for having killed Helena's son, when he's just kind of sitting there smirking and she's like, it was you, wasn't it? So here, where he's talking about how like, oh, it's really sus that Harwin and his father died in a fire, don't you think? Like, we hate Larys because it's obviously him that did it. Like, if we, as the audience, were like, did he though? It might have been Daemon who's sitting in this scene right now, who of course Daemon wouldn't say anything. Anyway, this scene would have been like turned up to 11 if the show had not committed to a explanation for how that happened, had left it ambiguous. But that ship has sailed, so where we are now, the scene was great. And then in general, how this whole episode, like I said last week, in the previous episode, that, we are teetering on the brink of civil war. And the fact that we are still another episode in and we're still teetering, it's still not quite there, but it feels like it's there because we've already had, bloodshed beyond just like individuals dying on each side. We've had a battle, I guess, arguably, with like the common people, but neither side actually like called for that. It was not actually like armies from either side. It was kind of like an already feuding situation. But the way that it shows, like, that's how these kind of things escalate and turn into war, is that, it's an assassination, it's a skirmish, it's a border dispute, it's two parties that already hate each other using this as an excuse to go and kill each other. So I just think it's doing such a good job constantly showing all the different ways that, like, well, really the Civil War is supposed to be about, like, these two at the top and their dispute about the crown and the throne, that, like, all these little other disputes, they just kind of, like, bubble up to the surface, and they all, like, decide to make this war the perfect opportunity to have it out with their issues, and how, like, you kind of can't, like, pull the cat back in the bag, like, you can't, like, I feel like there's an actual, like, idiom for this, but you can't, like, call it back, once the ball starts rolling, you can't undo the avalanche that begins. It's still not the idiom. Anyway, you know what I mean. So I think it's doing a great job of showing all these ways that it's just spiraling out of control. That they can sit there in their council rooms all they want talking about how, no, we're not going to start war. No, we're not going to, like, send troops or anything yet. We're going to, like, have peace talks. But it's like, look, it's taking on a life of its own. People are already fighting and dying. They didn't need your permission. And I love how the show in this episode showed both Alicent and Rhaenyra at different times both expressing that things have moved past a point of no return. So Rhaenyra says this to Rhaenys, who's telling Rhaenyra, hey, maybe we shouldn't go to war. Like, have you considered talking to Alicent? It doesn't need to be like this. And Rhaenyra is like, my son is dead. And that's like, we've moved past the point of no return. But then it is Rhaenyra who's like, okay, well, maybe actually, yeah. And the fact that she then goes to see Alicent, and Alicent is the one that's like, no, this has gone past a point of no return. Like, they both at different times have now expressed that, like, they're kind of on the same page on that it's like, they both feel doubt, they both don't really want war, but also both of them are like, yeah, but it's gone past that point though, like, we kind of have to. And the way that both Alicent and Rhaenyra are kind of like barely grasping the leash that's like containing their respective councils, the men that are just like chomping at the bit to plunge headfirst into war. And in some ways, Criston Cole has kind of become Alicent's Daemon, even so far as the parallel of Daemon has gone to Harrenhal, leaving Rhaenyra alone to try to prevent war. And Criston has left Alicent to go to Harrenhal, and Alicent is left behind to try to prevent war. And then lastly, the Song of Ice and Fire, and in general, the conversation between Alicent and Rhaenyra. I loved this scene, however unbelievable it is that it would happen. So, like, I do think it's kind of contrived and unbelievable that Rhaenyra would take the risk, that Alicent wouldn't arrest Rhaenyra. It's more believable to me that Alicent would not actually take Rhaenyra into custody than that Rhaenyra would take the risk. But that aside, be that as it may, we found a way to get them in a room together so we could have the scene of them face to face. So I like that we had that opportunity, despite the kind of like, I don't really buy itness of like how we got there. Here again, we saw Alicent and Rhaenyra both the same problem we had in season 1. They're both operating with incomplete information, which was the big problem with Viserys, where he was only giving half the story to the people around him. And that is like still to this day the thing that is like creating this war at this point, at least in the version of events we have in the show. So when they're discussing Viserys' last words, Rhaenyra wasn't there in the room when that happened. She has to go off of Alicent's word. But Alicent didn't know about the Song of Ice and Fire, so she didn't have full context to understand his words, and her, memory is faulty, so she remembers it the way she would have understood it at the time. It's not a perfect recording. And this, like, conversation where they're both utterly sure that they know what Viserys meant, because they're both utterly sure that they had a complete picture of the man that he was, and neither of them really does. And I also loved Alicent, the way she said, when she's expressing remorse over the position they're in, when she talks about Aemond and she says, you know what he is. She won't come out and say, but just that alone. So telling and so vulnerable. Oh yeah, and this was in my notes, but I skipped over it. Back to Harrenhal quickly. That like dream-ish sequence where for the first time we actually do see Daemon show some remorse over the fact that a child died because of him, which again, I don't think is intended to be like, oh, Daemon's actually a good guy. It's humanizing him. He is not a one-note character. So the fact that even to himself, like, it seems a surprise that he'd feel upset about it because he hasn't really shown remorse in public or in private about this. In general, he's very callous about things, like, throughout both seasons. Like, that he's, secretly a weepy, sad boy inside, I don't think. I think a scene like that is more so just, it's revealing to himself, more than to the audience, that deep down it does bother him a little bit, where like he disguises that even from himself, if that makes sense, that he's in such denial and so convinced himself to be confident in his decisions and to be callous and unfeeling, that it's this kind of like, the subconscious, dreams speaking to you about things that you won't reveal to yourself, that you won't admit to yourself. Anyway, I thought that scene was haunting and very well done. Anyway, yeah, I think it was a fantastic episode. The only issue that I had was Helena, which, she's not like one of the main characters, so it's not that big a deal, but yeah, that was the only miss for me. But let me know how you found it. Let me know whether the show is actually obviously pro-green or obviously pro-black or whatever you want to let me know, and I'll see you next week.